Hello, Earthlings and astronauts of all ages. Welcome back to another episode of Spacecraft. Science Officer Mily here reporting. We're back for part 2 of our 2-part Supermoon special, all about the full flower moon. And today I'm going to be talking about the formation and the geography of our moon. Let's get started. Here we are on the surface of the moon. We have our little astronaut moon friend right here. Like many astronauts before us, starting with Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong of the Apollo 11 mission, the first people on the moon, all the way up to the Apollo 17 mission, which was our last mission to the moon back in 1974.
Oops, the Apollo 17 mission was actually in 1972. That's when we were last on the moon. Sometimes scientists also forget some things.
And we actually haven't been back to the moon since, but we're going to be going back there soon, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the episode. First, we're going to take a look at how the moon was formed, and then we're going to take a closer look at the geography of the moon. For a hunk of rock and dust, our moon actually had a very fiery and explosive beginning. Early on in the formation of our solar system, when our Earth was very new and covered in volcanoes and lava and cooling rock, a smaller planetoid, which we call Theia, we think crashed into the side of our planet, causing a huge explosion and also causing the tilt of our Earth on its axis, which actually gives rise to our seasons. So we can thank this little planetoid for all of our beautiful different seasons. All the little pieces that broke off in the collision actually started sticking together because mass is attracted to mass through gravity, and they were held in Earth's orbit, the gravitational pull of our planet. And eventually they all stuck together and snowballed together into our beautiful moon. Early on in our moon's life, it was also a very fiery place with a very thin crust. Now, the dark spots that we see on our moon's surface, the side of the moon that we can see, those are called mare, which is Latin for sea. And early scientists thought they were actually oceans of water. We now know they're oceans of cooled rock because early on in the moon's formation, when it was hit by large asteroids, this would cause huge volcanic eruptions on its surface because the crust of the forming moon at the time was very, very thin. So even a medium-sized asteroid would cause a very large impact. Eventually, these volcanoes and lava flows cooled off on the surface of the moon and became these beautiful mare, or seas, of black volcanic rock that we see today. All the craters on the surface of the moon are constantly changing because it's continuously still being bombarded by asteroids. In fact, the moon actually catches some of the smaller asteroids that are careening towards our Earth, kind of acting like a goalie protecting the Earth's surface as it goes around it in its orbit. So next time you see the full moon, give it a wave and a thank you for blocking all those asteroids coming towards us.
The surface of the moon is coated in a fine dust called regolith that is even finer than sand. Here's a picture of a boot print left in the regolith by one of the first men to walk on the moon. A cool thing I like to think about is that this boot print, left over from the Apollo 11 mission, as well as all the other boot prints from the other Apollo missions, and the moon buggy tracks from the Apollo 15, 16, and 17 missions when they packed in a moon buggy, are actually still on the moon because there's no atmosphere, there's no wind to blow those tracks away. So the surface of the moon is kind of like a living museum of space exploration so far.
More recently, we're able to see even more detail of the topography of the moon. That means the elevation, all the different craters and valleys at different levels on the surface of the moon, due to something called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, a spaceship that mapped the surface of the moon. Here we can see all sorts of different amazing craters from all those asteroids, and also some flatter parts where there might have been some volcanic eruptions at some point. Pretty cool! The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter is a robotic spacecraft that has been orbiting the moon since its launch in 2009, and it's still going. So it's been taking pictures of the moon for us for over 10 years. And we're using this data to plan our next mission to the moon for Lunar Gateway. Lunar Gateway is a joint project between NASA, the Canadian Space Agency, the European Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency, and the Russian Space Agency, a lot of people coming together, to create a small space station that is going to orbit the moon. Similar to how the International Space Station orbits the Earth, the Lunar Gateway station is going to be about a fifth of the size of the ISS, providing us with a new base for space exploration. The missions to Lunar Gateway are going to allow us to learn how to live in space outside of low Earth orbit, far away from our home planet. And this will prepare us to go to Mars in the near future. Lunar Gateway is set to launch its first components up to the moon in 2022, so not that far from now. It's also going to provide us a home base around the moon so we can start building infrastructure and moon bases on the surface of the moon. Canada is going to be providing a very interesting part of the Lunar Gateway system, the artificial intelligence responsible for running and maintaining the ship. Because unlike on the International Space Station, where there is always a crew of astronauts keeping the ship running, Lunar Gateway is going to have long periods of time where there is nobody on the ship. So a robotic system, a magical system of robots, is going to actually keep the space station running, and Canada is going to be responsible for building those systems, including the Canadarm3, which is going to be a robotic arm like the Canadarm2, currently on the International Space Station, but it's going to be able to move around the station like an inchworm, looking around for different things that are broken and fixing it by itself completely autonomously. Robots in space. They're my favorite thing. I'm now going to hand you over to Craft Commander Green for a very fun full moon craft, but first I need to answer a letter that she sent me from last week. So you might have remembered a couple weeks ago we started sending letters back and forth as a fun way of communicating with our crewmates, and this week she sent me a letter and she wants to know my favorite astronaut, which is a very tough question. I would have to say there's two different astronauts that I really like. The first is Valentina Tereshkova, who is a Russian cosmonaut, and she was the first woman in space back in 1963, so way before the Apollo 11 mission in 1969, when we first put a person on the moon. And another favorite astronaut of mine is actually from Apollo 11, Michael Collins. He orbited the lunar orbiter as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin went down to the moon. He was left orbiting the moon all by himself. So he's known as the loneliest astronaut to ever live because he's the only person to be by himself in between the moon and the Earth. Pretty wild. I am going to send a space question back to Craft Commander Green and send that over to her now. I hope you enjoyed the second part of the Supermoon special. Make sure to look up in the night sky on May 7th for our beautiful full supermoon, the flower moon. Ta-da! Happy flower moon, everybody!
What's up, spacecrafters? Craft Commander Green here, just hanging out in low Earth orbit. No big deal. I am really digging it here. I have a spectacular view of the moonrise behind me. And I'm wondering, have you ever noticed when the full moon rises, it looks really gigantic, but then a few hours later, when it's higher in the sky, it looks smaller? Well, that's just an illusion. It doesn't change size at all. The reason it looks so huge when it first rises is because it's close to the horizon and we can compare it to other stuff. So you've got trees or rooftops or buildings, and that way we get a sense of the scale. So we can see how big the moon is. But when the moon is way high in the sky, there's nothing around it but sky. So we can't compare it to anything and it looks a lot smaller. Now, I came up with an experiment to prove that it stays the same size. And I'm not really sure if it'll work because I haven't actually conducted this experiment yet. So you'll be the scientists and you can tell me how it goes in the comments below. You're going to need a piece of acetate. This is like thick, sturdy plastic that you find in a lot of food packaging. You know, there's windows so you can see the food inside. This actually came from a box containing pie. We eat a lot of pie. So you take your acetate window, and after the moon has risen all the way, but it's still close to the horizon, get a felt pen, look at the moon through your acetate, and then carefully draw a line outlining your moon so you get the shape, the size on the acetate window, and then later in the night you can compare it and see if the moon fits inside of the circle that you drew. Pretty good idea. I'm so humble. So hopefully it'll work out. So this week, I'm extra excited about our craft because we are making mini moon bases. And not only do I love all things miniature and making dioramas, but I'm using retrofuturism as my inspiration. So what is retrofuturism? It sounds sort of oxymoronic because retro means looking back and futurism means looking to the future. Well, retrofuturism refers to artwork made back in the 1950s and 1960s that depicted how they thought the future would look. Now, back in the 1950s, they thought that by now we'd be living on the moon, that we would have colonized Mars and had flying cars and dishwashers that did the dishes for us. And wait a second, dishwashers do dishes for us. Sorry. Okay, but anyway, they made amazing art. And the best illustrations, in my opinion, are the ones that NASA had made by wonderful illustrators. So here I'm showing you a few examples. And my favorite out of these illustrations are the ones that are cutaways. This is when we can see inside of the moon bases and habitats and spacecrafts. And hey, wait a second, did I just see a man's butt? He was showering, it's okay. But yeah, so these are wonderful images and I love the aesthetic, very modern and sort of minimalistic. So we're gonna use that aesthetic to inspire us with our moon bases. So plug in your glue guns and let's get going.
For this project, we need scissors, a glue gun, some white and black paint or gray paint, some egg cartons or toilet paper rolls, any cardboard will do from your recycling bin, and a piece of mat board or cardboard to build everything on. Now, we also can use some colored paper, styrofoam balls if you have them, some plastic upcycled packaging, and a glue stick, but we'll get to that later. For now, take your mat board or your piece of cardboard and we're going to build a mountain range and glue it to that piece of cardboard. So I'm using egg cartons ripped up for my mountain range. They fit together very nicely. Or you could use ripped up toilet paper rolls or any upcycled cardboard will do. So using a bit of glue gun glue here, I'm going to stick down my pieces and start building my mountain range. If you don't have a glue gun, you could also use a glue stick or white glue. It just takes a little bit longer. You have to be a bit more patient. Okay, we're going to paint everything gray, but I have a tip here for you. When you're mixing your paint, always mix your dark into your light paint, because see how I just put some white into the black paint and it barely changes the color. But if I put just a little bit of black into my white paint, it really changes it quickly. So you end up saving paint that way. And now we're painting the mountain range and we're going to paint the whole base the same gray color. And then I can start bringing in darker grays and lighter grays and white to create highlights and lowlights. So the darker areas here represent where it's a lower elevation or where there's less light hitting the surface of the moon. So you have these nice dark areas, and this is another reason I like egg cartons, is because they already have little indentations, so it's easier to know where to paint. Okay, I'm using a dryer brush to create kind of a textured effect. You could also use a sponge, using darker shades of gray and lighter shades of gray, just to get more texture. And then this part I love, doing the highlights. So I'm using white paint now just to highlight where it's a higher elevation, where the light would be hitting, and now we can do some craters. So these are pretty easy to do. You just paint some circles in white and just do a few, some big, some small. And after you've got your white circles, you can start to create shadows. So I'm going to use this dark, dark gray and put a little bit of a shadow in the same place in each crater. That way we see that the light is coming from one light source. Makes sense. Okay, now using a mid-range gray, we're just going to sort of create more depth here. This makes it look like the craters are kind of popping out of the ground. And then we're going to do another little bit of a shadow with a lighter gray on the lighter side of the craters. And now I'm just using some white paint to kind of highlight some of the ground, because the ground isn't all flat and even on the moon. Some of it would be sticking up and receiving a little bit more light. So just making it more interesting. And now we can start building our moon base. So these egg cartons are great because you get all of these repeating shapes, and they're very modular and have that sort of retro futurism look that I love. So I'm going to be painting these white. Now you can paint these any color you like, but I'm keeping with that aesthetic. So everything's going to be white. And if you don't have egg cartons, a lot of people don't eat eggs, so that's okay. You could use toilet paper rolls. I think most people use toilet paper, or you can find other interesting shapes in your recycling bin. Just make sure whatever you're using is clean. Okay, so we've got our toilet paper roll here, and these are great because you can cut them up in so many different ways. You can get really creative. I'm just cutting mine into sort of like almost like little bridges, little archways here. But once you paint everything white, it becomes hard to tell where you got these cardboard pieces from, right? They become something else. I love that. So now here are all my little pieces that I painted white, and I also have some styrofoam balls that I've been saving up. And so this one I cut in half with an X-Acto blade. Please do not use an X-Acto blade unless you have a grown-up around to help you out. Okay, now it's time to start gluing things down. And I also have this plastic piece from some kind of container. I can't remember what it was from, but I'm going to use it as sort of a garden, like an atrium. So I'm just using the small part on the top to create an outline for my garden, or my sort of farm area, my vegetable garden. And I cut it out, and now I'm using 2 different shades of brown to create rows of soil. And now it's time for our vegetables and flowers. Why not grow flowers on the moon, right? So you can take any colored paper, and I'm cutting it up into little tiny squares. So much fun. And I'm going to create rows of different colored squares to represent vegetables, flowers. And it's like you're looking at them from really far away, so you just get these little dots. You don't need a lot of detail. So this one, I'm cutting it down the middle and then across so that all my little squares are the same size. This is going to be fun to glue on. Oh dear. It's like confetti. Veggie confetti. Okay, now I'm putting a little bit of glue just down one part of my garden, of the soil there, and gluing down my little green squares. And for the smaller paper squares here, I'm putting glue on my finger so that I can just pick it up like that. Now with the tissue paper, I sort of wanted it to look like little heads of lettuce, so I'm scrumpling it up and then using glue, but it's really tough to do to get it off the fingers, and then my fingers are all sticky, and I hate that feeling. Ooh. I also am using a scouring pad here to create little hedges, or you can make trees. In the long run, I decided not to use it. So gluing my farm or my garden down, and then we've got the top here, the atrium roof, and sticking it down. Pretty neat. Okay, and you can see I actually used some glue gun sticks there as part of my domicile. Now I'd love to see what you made, and if you post your work, please hashtag spacecraft moonbase. Or you could always send your work to us. The email's in the description below, and then we can post it at the end of an episode, like these wonderful moon bug finger puppets by Roman. All right, everyone, enjoy that full flower moon, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Until next week, stay curious and stay creative.